Hey everyone, this is what your pastor going to tell you. Today I'm on with the Bible exegete, otherwise known as Benny Cruchero. We're going to be talking about the biblical Exodus, whether it's the early date, the late date. Benny doesn't think that either are good arguments. How are you doing today, Benny?
Doing pretty good. Thank you for the invitation, and it's always a good topic to talk about. At least for me,
Yes,
it's
sir.
very exciting. I spend a lot of time studying it.
Yes, sir. Okay, great. So, uh, just general intro. What is your background in all this?
Um, I am a pastor, so basically today we're going to talk things I don't tell my church, just like your channel says, because I don't see that much of a relevance, at least to my audience, and it would bore many of them. So that's a good thing to have a channel with that name because there are things pastors don't tell their church for one reason or another. But I studied theology basically for my bachelor, for my MA, for my THM, and I'm right now looking for a PhD program. All of these degrees have been in the theological field, and I have an increased interest in biblical studies. Mostly, first part of my studies, I was more interested in the New Testament, but in the past few years, I've become much more interested in the Old Testament.
Cool. And obviously you kind of grew up on the early date, or yeah, the early date.
Yes,
Could you talk a little bit about that?
yes. In all the schools I studied, I was presented with the early date, and I didn't think too much about it because it wasn't a topic of interest. It would just pop on here and there, and I would look at the arguments a little bit and just accept what my professors told me. But then, with time, especially in the past 3 years, I really wanted to look into the arguments of all sides. And it's not just two sides, there are many more
Mm.
theories out there, but these are the ones that gain the most traction.
This is your reminder that Zach does not hold to all of the views held by the people he interviews. This could mean he disagrees, agrees, or is undecided on what they say. Like and subscribe to see my face more.
So let's start with the early date. All right. So you started at least your college career and all that with these early date arguments. Why exactly, or what exactly made you change your mind on this? What made you say that you didn't find them as very good arguments?
I look through the arguments, and maybe for our listeners, just to summarize a little bit the arguments of the early date, it goes something like this. It basically starts from a literal reading of 1 Kings 6:1 that talks about 480 years that passed since the foundation of Solomon's temple. And it's agreed by all sides that that year is 966, 967, based on Tilly's chronology. So going from this year, one of the two, because it's not 100% whether it's 967 or 966, going with the numbers we have in 1 Kings 6:1, we add 480 to 966, and that ends up with something like 1446. And therefore, the early daters say, based on this verse, the date of the Exodus is 1446. That's the argument. It's based on a literal reading of 1 Kings 6:1. But the problem of chronology is much more complex than that. It's complex because you have variants in the Septuagint. For example, right in this verse, in the Septuagint, you have 440 instead of 480. And so, with these variants taken into consideration, things can vary. 40 years is not a little. It can be something quite different when you look at the lives of the pharaohs.
Hmm.
Uh, so, going from this argument, they also use Judges 11:26, where Jephthah says that 300 years had passed since they settled in the country. It's obviously not a set number, it's an approximation, but it supports the early date Exodus view. And The problems I found was looking into the archaeology, into the historical data. We could come up with a number and say it's this date, it's this pharaoh, but when you start and break it down, looking at the exact pharaoh and going through his reign, things change, and that's where you need to look for evidence. And obviously, anyone can find circumstantial evidence.
Hmm.
You look at this detail or that detail and you make it fit with your own view. For example, the early Exodus supporters say that, look, in year 9, Amenhotep II, the proposed pharaoh, was the one that had a campaign and he brought about 100,000 slaves, if the numbers are real, to Canaan. And the reason is because they were out of slaves because they left the country. This is very circumstantial. It could be for a number of reasons. It could have been because he had some cities in Canaan that weren't paying tribute anymore and he just had to show them who's the strongest. And he brought all these slaves. It was maybe some internal policy that was changed. For 100 of reasons, we can argue what was the cause of that decision to take so many back to Canaan. So I don't find arguments like this compelling, and therefore one of the biggest reasons I stopped supporting the early date is no change in the pace of Egyptian development.
Hmm.
When you look at the text of the Bible and you see the plagues and how they develop, you expect some kind of change of pace in Egyptian development. If we were to put the finger and say it's this pharaoh, I would expect something to change. And obviously, the change should be negative. Now, I'm talking about early view, but maybe here and there I'll swing to the late view as well. The peak of Egyptian power was during the New Kingdom was reached sometime during the reign of Amenhotep III. What early daters are doing is placing the Exodus sometime around the reign of Amenhotep II. Some even favor Tutmos III, which was the Napoleon of Egypt. Basically, this guy was the biggest military leader Egypt ever had. At least a lot of people consider this view. So placing an exodus during the reigns of either of these kings, both of them were great military leaders, Thutmose III and Amenhotep II, placing the exodus during this time when Egypt is still increasing, it's still growing in its military capabilities, in its influence in the Levant, in its economy. I think it's not plausible. It's just circumstantial evidence that's brought, like the example I gave previously. Now, here's a thought that should entertain at least some of us. We have gone through the COVID pandemic, and as we were going through it, it affected all the world. I live in Romania, and by the way, I'm not a native speaker of English, so please excuse my English at points where I don't express it accurately. But this COVID pandemic affected United States, affected Eastern Europe, it affected China, it affected all the world. Do you think there were changes in policies?
Sure.
Were there changes in medical approach? Were there changes in economy?
Totally. Complete change.
Complete change. Well, this pandemic hasn't been something as awful as other pandemics have been through the history of the world. Now, why do I say this? We have the impression that those plagues that are presented in the Bible just happened for, let's say, 8 months or however long they took, somewhere around 6 to 8 months, maybe. That's what most scholars say. And then they just left and everything was back to normal. Well, imagine all the bugs, all the dead animals, all the death, all the dead bodies of the people. what is that going to cause in a world that doesn't have modern medicine, that doesn't have anything of the things we have today, some of the stuff being basic
Mm,
medical stuff? It could cause an epidemic. An epidemic can easily transform in a pandemic in a world that is global, that has economic relationships. You have ships going from Mycenae or from the Minoan Islands to Egypt. You have trades between the Babylonians and the Egyptians. You have all this,
mm,
and we know it for sure. Well, it could very well cause a pandemic.
sure.
And obviously, this is a part that a lot of archaeologists don't consider. There have been some good books written on this. One of them is written by a doctor. Philip Norrie is his name. He wrote A History of Disease in Ancient Times, More Lethal Than War. Many don't consider this aspect. Ariel
Mm,
Kozlov does a great job writing about trends and changes that happen during the periods of epidemics. It's written in Kemet. It's a Egyptian magazine. Very good. Um, just wanting to point to these things that I haven't read in any of the views. And I think it's
mm.
an aspect that needs to be considered when we study the evidence about the Exodus.
Okay, cool. Clarification question. So, obviously, you're right. Yeah, totally. I mean, specifically, if we're talking about all of Egypt having, all kinds of disease, plagues, all that kind of stuff, that's going to have an effect. Uh, of course, the late date view, we have, you see whether that's the cause of it. I don't know. I'm not going to say, but we definitely see like in the second part of Ramses II's reign, like things go crazy and it like goes downhill, which of course we don't see that in the early date. It's they're full of power, so you have a bunch of plagues, disease. That's one reason why we should see something. And the other thing is that if Israel, or not Israel, if Exodus, wow, if Egypt is so powerful during the reign of the whatever pharaohs of the early Exodus are, um, they're extremely like large military power as well. So like it'd be really difficult for them to be able to get out.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so like I totally get that. Say they're in Avaris, okay? Say the plagues
Okay.
are in Avaris, and that's where it is specifically, or
Okay.
wherever the pharaoh is at specifically. Um, Not the entire of Egypt. Is that possible under the early date?
I think that's possible in a way in both dates and not at the same time. Even if the plagues were local,
Okay,
that's how all pandemics start. Just think of the
sure.
COVID thing. It all started in Wuhan, in China,
Mm,
and it spread through all the world. They obviously didn't have airplanes back then when I checked research last time, but they still had trade. Basically, the Nile worked as their highway. They're going back and forth, trading on it.
mm,
Also, they had transactions with all kinds of people from the ancient Near East,
mm,
and all this could cause a pandemic. So even if it was local, it
okay.
could easily spread given
Mm,
their knowledge of medicine.
mm, okay.
Even if it was
Uh,
just a
mm,
city, if it was as half as big as the Bible says it was,
mm,
it could easily spread. That's my point. That's what I want to say.
gotcha.
And I
Okay.
don't find evidence for a plague that would turn into an epidemic or pandemic in either theories, nor the early nor the late.
You mean like texts that say, "Hey, there was this disease that happened"? Is that what you're saying?
Well, there are documents like the Hatti prayers of the Hittite king. At one point around 1300, he prays and says, the plague has been ruining our country for 30 years, and he tries to find the cause of the disease and how it started. And he actually says it started from Egypt when they had a war between Egypt and them. they got prisoners of war, and those prisoners of war from Egypt brought the plague. But he's trying to figure out a reason why is it happening to them, and he confesses. Most of them do that. They confess the sins of their ancestors, saying his
Mm,
dad or his brother, who also
right.
died because of the plague, were the cause of the plague. So you have certain details in certain documents of that time.
Hmm. Interesting. Okay. All right. So let's go on to your next one. You've got other reasons why you don't take the early date.
Yes. So my first reason was no change in the pace of Egyptian development. My second reason is the archaeological data from Jericho. I think Jericho is an important site that needs to be studied by both parts. It's not the only argument. And another thing is, a lot of people focus on Jericho, but there are other cities that need to be studied as
Sure.
well. But because Jericho is the biggest and it was studied intensively starting in the 30s, 1930s, all the way to about our time, we have a lot of information from Jericho. Basically, the last Egyptian scarab found, and not just scarab, any artifact that came from Egypt found at Jericho, was the scarab of Amenhotep III. He started reigning sometime around 1390 until 1353. This was found in the tombs at Jericho. Early daters would say that it's plausible with the chronology they're using by dating Amenhotep II to 1446. The biggest problem is that pottery found at Jericho is specific to mid 14th century, just as the scarabs prove that Jericho was an Egyptian vassal in the 14th century. You wouldn't have scarabs unless there was some kind of connection with the Egyptians. They were either vassals or they had some economical contract or something. Basically, pottery, walls, and Egyptian inscriptions, mostly scarabs, are the three proofs that show us whether we got the chronology right or not. And
Hmm.
having a scarab of Amenhotep III makes it unlikely that it would be during his, or yeah, basically during his reign, they would place it that Jericho was conquered. Another thing, obviously, Jericho, many think this, but it's wrong. Jericho wasn't a huge city like many envision it based on Joshua. But it was walled, it had enough residents so the spies could hide in it. Also, one of the leading archaeologists, recent archaeologists on Jericho, favors the existence of a palace in the 14th century because of an administrative tablet that was found. So the problem is the early Exodus places the conquest of Jericho sometime around 1406. While you would have to take the chronology, we'll talk about this a little bit later. You'd have to take the chronology about 20 years, and you would basically only have the last years of Amenhotep III. But the scarab we have is from his early years. So it's a very complicated situation given that this is the last scarab we have found. But what's interesting, and I will quote here one of the leading archaeologists on Jericho, Kathleen Kenyon, she draws the following conclusion from the archaeological data, and I'm gonna tell you it's very interesting. You rarely find this quoted by either sides because it favors neither sides. It's quoted from, let me see, from Digging Up Jericho. It was published in 1957.
Hmm.
And I'll talk a little bit more about Kenyan soon. The quote goes like this: as concerns the date of the destruction of Jericho by the Israelites, all that can be said is that the latest Bronze Age occupation should, in my view, be dated to the third quarter of the 14th century BC. That is 1350 to 1325 approximately. That's when she dates the destruction of Jericho. And she continues and says, this is a date which suits neither the school of scholars which would date the entry of the Israelites in Palestine to circa 1400 BC, nor the school which prefers a date of circa 1260 BC. So basically, according to Kenyon, the leading scholar on Jericho, both popular theories that are still standing now after 100 years do not accommodate the data from Jericho. And in case somebody considers her statement ambivalent, Kenyon makes an even stronger statement when she says, "It is a sad fact that of the town walls of the late Bronze Age, within which period the attack of the Israelites must fall by any dating, not a trace remains." So she's aware of the fact that the walls of the late Bronze 2B, which is the 13th century, were leveled basically. This is the argument that late daters use and say, well, we don't really have data if it was conquered or not because we don't have the walls. But what we have is we have pottery and we have scarabs. And the scarab, the last scarab from Jericho, is from around 1380 approximately, from the reign of Amenhotep III. And then during the 13th century, when we have the late date, the evidence for pottery is very scarce. Lorenzo Nigro says during the Ramesside reign, there is a dramatic drought of archaeological evidence. Now, she agrees, and everyone agrees, there was some kind of leveling that took place, not necessarily in the 13th century, more like in the Iron Age, which would be like the next century on. There was a leveling of the walls. But even when you level walls, the pottery remains there. I mean, you're gonna level the walls, but pottery's gonna break. Whatever's left there is still going to be there. They might take the rocks, they might take what's there, but there still should be some kind of evidence, and it's very, very scarce. Now, obviously, Jericho, compared to the second intermediate period size of the city, was much smaller. Uh, as I said, many have the wrong idea, it was this huge city.
Yeah, right.
It's the story in the Bible that wants to present the first conquest, and we need to understand Joshua was also national and patriotic literature. I'm not minimizing the event of the Bible, and I do believe it happened the way it is presented, but the fact that walls fell apart without a military attack by itself, it's something extraordinary, no matter how small or big that city would be. As long as they didn't have the modern technology, not even from the Middle Ages where they would have those ramps where like the Romans to conquer cities. Still, it was a great feat to conquer such a city, no matter how big or small. But you would still have some evidence. It was still a city. Like I was saying before, Lorenzo Nigro, he believes there was some palace there. If you had a palace, it was something, at least mildly important. You had scarabs, so they had some connections with the Egyptians. It was something that was positioned in a good place. They had waters there. They had the Jordan that wasn't too far. They had interior springs in the city. So, given all these details, you would expect that since the conquest would have taken place at the end of the 13th century, so basically about 80 years of the 13th century, you would have people living there, having pottery, breaking it, having all kinds of stuff and life taking place there. There would be some evidence left. Yet, the evidence is very, very, very little. Even the Bible, it doesn't say that they didn't use Jericho after the walls were destroyed. We need to understand that the exterior walls were destroyed, but the inner part of the city remained there. And we have evidence in the book of Judges twice that it was used. It was used in chapter 1, and then it was used by the Moabite king where he lived, and we have the episode with Ehud in chapter 3. So it was still used. It was maybe just temporarily, maybe people were coming, sitting there for a while and leaving. It wasn't something, major. It wasn't like a city anymore because it wasn't
Mm.
walled anymore. But, it was like free lodging. There was a roof above the head, maybe in some of those places, and they still used it. All this thinking that the conquest of Jericho in the late date theory would take place around 1220, you'd have 80 years in which you should have some pottery, you should have some grain, you should have that kind of stuff, and you don't have it. Now,
Hmm.
like I said, I'm swinging both ways in a way, both with the late and with the
Mm.
early date theory.
Sure.
But this is one reason I don't find the arguments of either theories compelling. The archaeological data from Jericho, as Kenyon says, doesn't favor either theory.
Hmm. Now, just so we're on the same page and while we're at it, so for the late date, you said there's no evidence. Now, what? Now, I'm no expert, I'm no archaeologist. So, just to be clear, you say no evidence. Does that mean that there's no evidence of like anything? Like we don't have anything there? So, are you implying that like there was just nobody there at that time, or that we've lost it, or what?
No, it's here's evidence. It's very, very little. And we do know this, it's accepted because of erosion and especially because of leveling. So what they did in antiquity was a city that wasn't used anymore, they would basically take anything they could from it.
Mm.
Or just to use it for another reason, they would level it, they would make it straight. They
Yeah,
would
flat.
take the rocks, they would take the beams, wooden beams, they would take every single thing that they could use. It's not like they could go to Home Depot and buy stuff. Wood was very scarce. Rocks
Hmm.
were chopped, and it was better to grab a rock that was chopped than chopping one by yourself. So, because of this activity of leveling, obviously evidence was destroyed. But what I'm saying is there at least should be a little bit more evidence because it wasn't a village still before it was conquered. I'm not saying it was a huge city, but if you have 80 years of a city like this being lived in, you would have some growing, some leveling, not leveling, deposits taking place, happening
Hmm.
just by people living there for about 80 years.
Hmm.
And yeah, it's true that it was leveled, but the evidence is very, very little. Now, Nigro, Lorenzo Nigro, the one that has done the latest research or led the
Hmm.
latest research on Jericho, reanalyzed all the data from Kenyon. He's not a Bible believer. He doesn't believe the Exodus even happened. So he's just doing his work and research. And he says basically the evidence is very, very little. Kenyon said there was basically no pottery, nothing. He comes in and he still finds something here and there, but it's very, very little.
So just so I have your position, well, the typical, what happened because of this leveling, which is, supposedly when there should have been people there, um, during all this events of the conquest for people that take the late date view. Um, During this time period, are you saying that we should see some type of pottery? Maybe it's not Israelite, but just some type of pottery or
Yeah,
some evidence of
yeah.
something. And because we don't see that, maybe that's a good reason to think that just nobody was really there at all.
I wouldn't say nobody, but it wasn't a walled city that was lived uh, by a
Sure.
population that lived and was settled there.
Hmm.
uh,
Hmm.
I mean, they're 80 years, they're about
Right.
80 years in which, so that's most of the century. According to the late date, the city would have been destroyed somewhere around 1220, give or take, depending on the view they're
Yeah.
taking regarding the reign of Ramses II when
Hmm.
it started. Maybe 8 plus minus 8 years.
Hmm.
So
But you also admit that it wasn't like a huge town. So we certainly wouldn't expect a lot of stuff like previous times in Jericho, but you're just saying that we should expect more.
The peak of the size of the city, Ruha was its ancient name,
Mm-hmm.
was during the Hyksos period, the second intermediate period. And
Mm-hmm.
when the walls were studied, that was the peak when it was reached. It was destroyed probably by Ahmose the First, or maybe a little bit later, and then it restarted its life, but in a smaller size.
Mm-hmm.
But this doesn't mean it was a village, like I said. Uh, it was still a walled city. You had scarabs, you had cuneiform tablets. All this indicates that, there was economic life there. There were treaties. The location was very, very good. And so you would expect more. And you do have more in the 14th century. You have Mycenaean pottery. That means they traded with basically the population of Greece of today, somewhere around there. You had all these evidences that take place in the 14th century, happen in the 14th century. You have buildings in the 14th century. And this is the reason Kenyon places the destruction somewhere in the second part of the
Mm-hmm.
14th century.
Okay. All right. And now, is there anything else you want to add, or you want to keep going?
Yeah, we can
Okay.
keep going. There would
All
be a
right.
lot to talk about, but I'll stop here.
All right. Use of high chronology. What do you got to say about that?
This is, I would say, another problem of the early Exodus date, because right now, obviously, chronology has its flexibility in the Bronze Age, but
Mm-hmm.
it's not like we're talking about 100 years, 200 years. Obviously, not even the early daters are using that much of a difference. To quote Kenneth Kitchen, he considers that for the New Kingdom, which spans from about 15, depends on which view you take, 1539 to about 1069 approximately, you have uh, a range of about 20 years for a margin of error. And maybe in the past years this decreased a little, but we'll go with what he wrote in the 90s, which I think it's correct. 20 years is the margin of error for the New Kingdom Egyptian chronology. Well, the early daters come and they move the date of Amenhotep's reign, that according to the middle date, or the low middle chronology, was around 1425, and they move it to about 1455. That is 30 years. So basically, they're adjusting the chronology of Amenhotep II by 30 years. You have the minimum given by Kenneth Kitchen or the maximum, sorry, not the minimum, the maximum margin of error of about 20 years. So this is another problem. Another problem in this area would be sometimes they use the low chronology, sometimes they use the high chronology. Things get really complicated. You got to know what you're reading, who you're reading, and this, we need to understand that we do have evidence for a lot of the pharaohs, but sometimes we don't know exactly how long they reigned. Sometimes we don't know if there was a co-regency or not. It's the same
Right.
thing with the Israelite and the kings of Judah. And so we need to leave some room for a margin of error. And the consensus, the academic consensus at this point, is about a maximum of 20 years. Well, they go with about close to 30 years difference. And so this is a problem. And like I said, sometimes they're not using it accurately. Sometimes they go with the low chronology. Sometimes they go with the high chronology. This needs to be read carefully when you work with the information you receive, because you'll see maybe a specific year, let's say 1288. Well, for some, 1288 is the beginning of Ramses II's reign. For others, it's during Seti I's reign, because of this margin that can be used back and forth a little here and there. It's not like our modern chronology when we say, 2023 and everybody knows and it's settled and nothing's going to change. we need to understand that in the matters of chronology, it takes a little humility in working with this, because we do not have the absolute exact dates, but we're pretty close. I'd say, given we're talking about a period that happened 3,500 years ago, 20 years is not a lot.
Basically, what you're saying is that it's really difficult to match up the times with the early date if you're not using the high chronology, but at this point there's really little evidence for the high
Yeah.
chronology.
The high chronology has been in favor early in the 20th century. But with time, especially in the second half of the 20th century, things have changed. And now people are going more towards a low chronology, and actually what's called, not low, sorry, I said low multiple times, middle chronology. I'm wrong. I retract. It's a middle low chronology. So from the middle chronology, you go another 8 years behind. Most of the times, that's what it is about. So it could be a long discussion, and we could just talk hours and hours just about this detail, because chronology is very important.
Um, yeah, I'd recommend David Falk and Titus Kennedy's debate on that. They kind of got into the chronology just a little bit. And do you know what Titus Kennedy, what his view was on that?
Well, basically, he goes with this high chronology, and David Falk, he talked about this, that it's not correct to use the high chronology.
Hmm.
And
Gotcha.
I agree with that argument.
Mm-hmm. All right, so number 4, cities conquered in Joshua are thriving under the Amarna period.
Yes.
Do you want with more?
Yeah, I think this is one of the most important arguments. We need to know what Amarna is. Basically, this is the modern name of the city. Back then, it was called Akhet Aten, which was the palace, more than the capital. It was more like a palace city, made for King Akhenaten. He moved the capital in a way, or the palace, he moved it to this city he built, and it didn't live long. It was short lived, because he was the heretic pharaoh that created that religious revolution. And soon after him, the new kings like Horemheb, they wanted to go back to the to the order that they had previously, with the gods that they all believed in. And therefore, we know the period in which this capital was in place. Well, the great thing is that here at Amarna, the modern city of Tel El Amarna, they found the archive of the pharaoh, or to be exact, of multiple pharaohs. And it's a collection of about, where's the camera? It's a collection of about 382 letters, of which 350 have relevance and can be read. And most of them are the corresponding between the Canaanites and the Egyptians. Now, we rarely hear the response of the Egyptian pharaoh, but we read what the Canaanite kings, but they weren't kings, they're called mayors. The Canaanite mayors were writing to the Egyptian kings. And we have the last part of Amenhotep III, mostly his last part of the decade. We also have Akhenaten, all his reign, and it goes all the way to Tutankhamun, the famous pharaoh. So basically, roughly speaking, it's a period of about 30 years. And as we read these letters, in these letters, we find important names that are mentioned in the Bible. They're mentioned in the book of Joshua. And we read city names like Hatzor, Lachish, Megiddo, Bethshan. Many of these cities are said in the book of Joshua to be conquered. Yet, when we read the letters of Amarna, we see them in existence. We see some of them thriving. There are some disputes with a certain population called Habiru, and other disputes that they have in between them, but they're standing. And therefore, I think this is one of the strongest arguments against an early date.
Hmm.
These would be just a few arguments. I could go with more, but I'll stop here against the early date. And this is what made me change my mind regarding the early date.
Gotcha. Really fascinating. Okay. All right. So let's get on to kind of the late date topic, but maybe a little shift. So I was really interested to hear what you thought about Exodus 1 and the interesting different views on that because like, who the Pharaoh is, of course, in Exodus 1, a specific Pharaoh's name isn't mentioned,
Yeah.
but at the same time, it seems like there's a lot of stuff going on and maybe even different time periods. Um, so, could you talk about, what is happening at Exodus 1, um, you know, the slavery and new king in Egypt, and then, I guess different theories to explain like who the kings, the pharaohs are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, there's a clear sequence of events that takes place in Exodus 1:11. To talk about the arguments of the late date, basically, the late daters focus on a literal reading of Exodus 1:11, which says, "Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy
Mm.
burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses." So we know from history that Ramses lasted from about, let's say, 1279, the first year of Ramses II reign, although it wasn't exactly this one, to about 1130. That's when it was in use until the new capital was built and moved to Tanis. So you have a specific period of time in which you have the city name Ramses used as the capital of Egypt. And therefore, the late daters rely on a literal reading of Exodus 1:11. Now, we need to read the sequence in which all these events are mentioned in the book of Exodus. And I would say also the book of Genesis is relevant in this topic as well, because it tells us how they ended up in Egypt. Basically, because of the famine during the time of Jacob and of Joseph, they moved with all their families to Egypt and they stayed there. As we say in Romanian, Joseph was on high horses, meaning, he was up there. He was actually having a chariot, riding a horse, and all that. He was in charge of the country. Not the first one, but he was maybe the equivalent of a vizier. And we need to understand that it wasn't all the Egypt as we know it. Now, late daters and very few early daters, but late daters, almost all late daters agree that this took place during the Hyksos period. The Hyksos came to power somewhere around, let me see if I remember the numbers correctly, around 1630, somewhere around there. And they were basically Asiatic, Semitic population that moved to Canaan. We see this in Genesis a lot. When famines took place, a lot of Canaanites and people from Canaan went to Egypt to find food. We see Abraham doing this. We see Jacob. We see Isaac. All the big three are doing this. And people started asking themselves, most likely, well, why should we just go back and forth? Why shouldn't we settle here? Because famines just happen all the time in Canaan and in Syria. And so they settled there, and this Asiatic Semitic population grew and grew and grew. And at one point, we do not know exactly, there was some void of power. And somehow these Asiatic Semitic populations took charge of northern Egypt. When northern Egypt and southern Egypt broke, they were separated. And this usually happens in the intermediate periods. First intermediate period, second intermediate period. Anyway, in this context, you have Joseph having the favor of a population that might have been culturally similar to them, and he ends up in power. But things don't go all the way like that. And there's an interesting detail in Genesis. We know that he buried Jacob in Canaan. And we know that Joseph also wanted this, but he wasn't buried in Canaan. Now, my reasoning is that if he could have been buried in Canaan, Joseph would have told them, "Go bury me in Canaan." But he can't. In Exodus 1 says that that Joseph died and then the next Pharaoh came. We could see if there's a margin here or not, but there's another option. We know that when Ahmose I came to conquer Avaris, he didn't go straight forward. What he did was he went to the area of the Suez Canal of today, and he basically locked the country because parts of the Hyksos fled to Canaan into Syria. And therefore, in order to not let the enemy flee, but to basically lock them within the country, he captured the garrisons that were over there to the east of Egypt. And then he went and sieged Avaris, which wasn't a too long of a siege. And so I think this is what happens in this period. Joseph dies within this period of either siege or around the time when the country was locked and they were fighting with the southern dynasty, the Theban dynasty. And this is the reason he can't go to Canaan and be buried there or give the order. Because there were a lot of people. I mean, even if he didn't have an army from the Pharaoh, there were men, there were a large tribe, there were a large clan, they had slaves. They could easily gather 100, 200, even a smaller number would have been enough to take him to Canaan and have him buried there. So I think this context fits really well with the conquest of Ahmose I in this period of siege, and this is the reason behind him not giving the order to bury him in Canaan. Because he couldn't. He wanted it really badly. He wanted it that bad because he ordered them and told them, when God is gonna, it doesn't say free you there, but when God is going to search you or something like that is in English, then you can go and take my bones with you. And so in this context comes Exodus 1, which basically tells us they multiplied, a new Pharaoh came, and many understand these words of a new Pharaoh meaning a new dynasty, which is the 18th dynasty. This would be Ahmose I, the founder of the 18th dynasty, the period of the new kingdom, the most important period probably that a lot of people know and talk about. And so here we have a sequence of events that is presented in Exodus 1. From verse 1 to 7, it basically tells us Israel stayed in Egypt. Then verse 8 through 10, it tells us a new Pharaoh enslaved the Israelites. Then 11th verse says they built Pithom and Ramses. Verses 12 through 14, they multiply even more. Then the 5th sequence of events, Pharaoh orders the midwives to kill the baby boys. And the 6th event, Pharaoh ordered everyone to kill the boys because the midwives didn't listen. And then comes chapter 2, where Moses is born under this order. Basically, what the author wants to do is to introduce Moses and how his story took place. And in order to do that, he needs to do a summary or a recap of all of the events that took place in Egypt in this period. According to the sequence of events presented in Exodus 1, Moses' birth comes after the Israelites started working on the cities of Ramses. So we're told in verse 11 that the city of Ramses was built, and then his birth comes only in chapter 2. Now, Ramses the Great started ruling in 1279 BC, and he built the city of Ramses, just like his name says. Even if he started building in his first year, and Moses was born in that very year, there's not enough time for everything mentioned in Exodus to happen. Moses would have been 14 at the time of the Exodus, because that's usually when the Exodus is placed, somewhere around 1265. Hofmeyr places it in 1267. Even if we say it's 1260, let's go as low as 1260, he would have been less than 20 years old. Remember, we need to have enough time for him growing up, his vigilante crime, his running away from Egypt to Midian, his marriage, birth of 2 boys, and the death of all the men that wanted to kill him, according to Exodus 4:19. And this is a very important detail because they had to die. It wasn't just the Pharaoh. The word there is used for plural, men, because there were many people that knew about his crime, and the text says all of them died. So we could just guesstimate how long it would have taken for these people to die, but my estimation is somewhere of around at least 20 years for all these events to take place. Another aspect might be an argument or not. I think Moses' reluctance to go speak to Pharaoh indicates he had forgotten Egyptian because a very long period of time passed since he spoke. Now, he says he's not a good speaker, but it could be as well interpreted as, I'm not a good Egyptian speaker. And you forget a language if you don't speak it for a number of decades.
Sure.
Therefore, because of this sequence of events, when we look at them, I think they're not plausible with the late date. Now, the response to this, and Dr. Falk responds to this and others as well, is that it's an amalgamation. Basically, a mix of details that isn't presented chronologically. And I looked into this argument as well. I don't think it stands. I rather read it as a summary, and I'll explain immediately the perspective of Dr. Falk. There's a difference between a summary and an amalgamation.
Right.
When we want to tell a short story or just share something in a few details, we just go through a few events. Like if I were to ask you the history of America in 1 minute, something like that. Well, you could start with, let's say, Columbus, and then you would go to the Revolutionary War. You could go then to the Civil War, maybe mention Second World War, and here we are today, and just go through a few details. But look what I did. I did them in chronological order. I was in the 15th century, then 18th, 19th, 20th, and here we are in the 21st century. Now, obviously, somebody would say, well, that's not how they did it in antiquity. Well, I looked through the Bible, and I didn't find other examples of amalgamation that are out of chronological order. You look through the book of Genesis. They don't present Jacob, and then they start with Abraham, then they go to Isaac. They go through the sequences of events. Now, obviously, they don't give us all the details. It's just glimpses here and there. Mm-hmm. But there's a chronological, obvious sequence of events. When you look through the Bible, you go through from Genesis to the last book of the Old Testament, and you see the history of Israel, at least majorly speaking, in chronological order. It's not all the time that it's in chronological order, but that doesn't mean the author just flips from this place to another chronologically. And what I did, I asked this very question. I asked Dr. Falk this very question, and he gave me the answer. And I will show you a timeline that he has made of this. It's the classical answer you will get from late daters. Just for a break here, can I put it on the screen?
I'll put it on later. Don't worry about it.
You'll put it on later.
Yeah,
okay.
You can just read from it.
Yeah. So basically, it starts in circa 1520 BC with Ahmose I becoming the new king that arose over Egypt, and he didn't know Joseph. As I said previously, most likely by this time, Joseph was dead, as the text says. Then from step number 1, which is in verses 8 and 9, he goes to verse number 10, which the Israelites are seen as a military threat if they ally with the Hittites. Now, we have a skip from 1520 to 1320s. That's 200 years, a jump of 200 years. Now, I know Dr. Falk laughs at the idea that Ahmose I would see the Hyksos as a threat, but we need to understand one thing. The Egyptians, and especially the 18th dynasty, learned a very terrible lesson because of the Hyksos. I mean, they had pharaohs that were killed by the Hyksos. The Theban dynasty, the 17th dynasty, had pharaohs that were killed by the Hyksos, and that's why Ahmose I wanted so bad to revenge the death of his ancestors. As the old saying goes, once burned, twice shy. I think it fits really well the fact that Ahmose I understood we need to be really careful about these people that are in our country. It might not be a specific enemy that he was thinking about, but he was thinking in general terms. When we're going to have a war, when we're going to have enemies, we're going to have enemies from the outside, but we might as well have enemies from the inside. So we're not just going to let these people here run their business as usual. Plus, they were a good workforce. Therefore, I think the idea that this Pharaoh that decides to enslave the Israelites fits very well with Ahmose I as well, the very king that arose over Egypt. And another interesting thing, we have speech bubbles, sort of. We have direct speech from these pharaohs, and they're quoted. Obviously, they weren't quoted in the ancient manuscripts, but we can see when the author goes from indirect speech to direct speech. And he says in a first person manner, "Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." So you see a connection between what is told about this Pharaoh in verses 8 and 9, and then what he says in verses 9 and 10. Therefore, I think this jump from Ahmose I, 1520, and then to 1320 approximately, is too much of a jump. Interestingly enough, then in verse 111a, Dr. Falk goes back to 1520. So verses 8 and 9 are in 1520. Verse 10 is in 1320. And then in verse 11a, he goes back to 1520. And it says that they had to do hard labor. The fourth sequence, the building of Pithom and Ramses, he jumps from 1520 to approximately 1270, to the reign of Ramses II, when Pithom and Ramses were built. And then the fifth episode or stage, he goes back to Ai or Horemheb. It's not clear which one of them is. The order to kill the Israelites' babies is given by either Ai or Horemheb. That's the perspective of Dr. Falk. So you have this back and forth going, which is covered by the idea that it's an amalgamation. For a time when people were really interested in presenting things in a narrative style, I agree, there weren't the perfect historians were today, or this sort of history is always difficult to be written, but they didn't have the same skills as we do today. They didn't have the same requirements as we did today, but still jumping 200 years back and forth, then going another 50 years in the past and all that, it's really out of order, even if they didn't know all these names. And I'm sure they didn't even know the names of these pharaohs. but still, there's a sequence of events that takes place. And at least that sequence of events was transmitted in the oral narrative they presented, or if they had it in a narrative form.
Hmm.
Therefore, looking at Exodus 1, through these events in the sequence they're presented there, I rather see it as a summary. It's a short summary that prepares the second chapter where Moses comes to the scene, what led to him being in that situation,
Hmm.
and also a recap of their history. It's true, it's a few hundred years that are in 22 verses, but that doesn't mean there's that much jumping, for a couple of centuries from here to there and then going back and so on.
Well, I mean, Genesis does something like that when we talk about like huge time gaps and like 11 chapters worth, supposedly 1,000 plus years, and 11 chapters worth, and all kinds of different stories happening. Um, Maybe not exactly here. As far as the time gap, so like I think that's definitely plausible. That there's a large period of time here. Um, I think, I mean, I'd be interested to know what other scholars have said about this, because I think that if you're going to argue for this amalgamation view here, that you have to point to somewhere else in the Hebrew text, or maybe even outside the Bible, where this would be common or even possible. I'm not familiar with the time when you have all this jumping, um, although I'm certainly open to the idea of like Exodus in general. There's a lot going on here. Okay, Carmen Joy Imes has written on in her book, but basically it was a book, and she had just one article in the book. It was like kind of like in honor of John Walton. But basically, what she does is she takes all of the creation language in Exodus, and it's a ridiculous amount, like ridiculous. And of course, in Exodus 1, we have just a couple examples of that. You have like the Pharaoh is seen as like as wise, and then the Israelites they're multiplied. You have parallels to the serpent and the Pharaoh, and then you have parallels of Genesis 1, greatly multiply, fill the earth,
Yeah,
and then you have that with the Israelites.
yeah.
But it's like a ridiculous amount. So I know with certainty that something is going on here, that it's not completely literal, but at the same time we don't have this amalgamation. I don't know anywhere else in the text, so I'd like to see that from Falk and others. Uh, do you know, like Hoffmeyer, Kitchen, did they present any views on how they saw the pharaohs here?
So Hoffmeyer goes with Ahmose the First as
Uh-huh.
being the initial pharaoh that does the enslavement.
Mm,
I think Kitchen does the same. It's the main um, late Exodus date proposed pharaoh,
mm,
and I agree. I think it's the best context
mm.
that suits the history.
Okay.
A lot of early daters don't accept this because it would be too early and it would be too late.
Yep.
Because you have the idea based on Exodus 12:40 that it was 430 years that they were in Egypt,
Right.
but we have the Septuagint variant that says that they were in Egypt and in Canaan for 430 years. And when you split it into two, the time they spent in Canaan and the time they spent in Egypt, it goes down to something like 215 in each of the two.
Mm,
And of those 215 in Egypt, when you break it down, about 100 something years of slavery. So the old saying that goes in the movies, we've been slaves for 400 years, according to the Masoretic text, is true, but according to the Septuagint is not true. And I favor, in this case, the Septuagint. Also, Paul favors this in Galatians 3, and maybe Acts 13 can be used as an argument.
and we could talk about that in a second, a little get more detail there. But specifically with Hoffmeyer and Kitchen, and you said Akmosa, but what about like Falk proposes I Hornheb. You have this switching going back and forth. Then you have the mention of the city of Ramses. Like does Hofmeier and Kitchen ever argue for this like switching back and forth, or do they comment on it? I didn't see any of their books.
I I I'm trying to remember where I read or listened to their arguments in this, but their arguments go in the similar line. I
Really?
haven't read as much Kitchen as I did Hofmeier,
Uh-huh.
but I'm almost certain I did read something in the same line as Dr.
Interesting.
Falk, and I don't think
Okay.
it's Dr. Falk's argument per se,
Okay.
as he studied and he references both of them a lot
Right.
of the times.
Sure. Yeah. So, all right, let's talk about this. So, I mean, I know that, there's a lot of people that take these views. I'm not an expert. I'm just trying to read the text. Um, at the same time, like, I'm curious to see. Okay, so first of all, this Ramses point. Well, actually, no. Let's start. All right, let's start with verse 8. Okay, so it says, it's going from, they're in this. Joseph is in the Israel, or Joseph is in Egypt, and then a new Pharaoh comes to town that Joseph
Mhm.
didn't know about Joseph, and he came to power. So I don't see a particular reason. Maybe you can tell me where I'm wrong, but I don't see a particular reason why we have to assume that that is Akmosa the first. Like, yes, I think we certainly have to say that there was a change of some kind, but it doesn't specifically say what king. And all of the king or all the pharaohs that were mentioned here that are in this discussion would not known about Joseph. And all of the pharaohs also came to power over Egypt. So if those are what we're considering are like classifications for which pharaoh to choose here, I don't see why it specifically has to be Ahmose. Do you understand what I'm saying?
I understand what you're saying. We don't read literally the idea he didn't know Joseph.
Mm-hmm.
The meaning behind the words is, to put it bluntly, he didn't care anything about Joseph or his descendants.
Right.
Now, if there was a continuity of a dynasty, if it was the son of a previous pharaoh that came to power, he
Mm-hmm.
would have had respect for the allies of his father.
Right.
And that's why a lot of scholars are talking about a change of dynasty as well.
Mm-hmm.
Because to know somebody is not in the sense of he never met Joseph. Even if he had never met Joseph, he would have known about him, what he did for the country, and he would have known, look, these guys are his relatives. So we're going to be in good terms with them because of everything that Joseph did for the country.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if Joseph is perceived as a Hyksos by the Theban dynasty,
Mm-hmm.
then anything that came from the Hyksos was perceived as negative by the Theban dynasty.
Right. Right.
And that's the argument that's supported by Hofmeier, by Kitchen,
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Falk, and many others.
Right. So maybe I missed something, but
So, oh my goodness.
it's a nice ringtone there.
Sorry. Say that again.
So maybe I missed something, but right. So I mean, certainly there's some type of shift, dynasty change, whatever. We don't necessarily like. I mean, yeah, I think we can imply that who did not know about Joseph can imply that didn't know all about the great things about Joseph, all the great things that the Israelites did. So like, he's not going to care about the Israelite people now. I mean, that seems like obvious. But like, so if the issue is like you have all this switching here, like why not say that I or Hornheb was the pharaoh that verse 8 refers to? Okay, so just so I'm being clear, I'm implying here that there's a huge time gap between the Joseph and verse 8, verse 7 and verse 8. So I mean, if we're talking about like when the the book of Exodus was written, we're talking about, after everything happens, we're talking about probably Moses or maybe even somewhere later than that saying, hey, this is like, our tradition, what we've remembered. So, if I'm in Moses' perspective, I'm thinking, okay, so, our ancestors, Joseph was in charge, and then some guy came along and he didn't know Joseph, and then that's what starts this whole story. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there weren't more people that didn't know Joseph. It could be that there's this just big time gap that isn't worth mentioning for the story. Maybe Moses doesn't even know. I mean, I don't know exactly. I mean, but yeah, go ahead, keep going.
If I look at Exodus 1,
Mm-hmm.
you have this king mentioned in verse 8 that he rises to power.
Mm-hmm.
And in the next verse, immediately, you have a speech bubble.
Mm-hmm.
He said to his people. Now, obviously, it could be a skipping if you want to introduce a skipping here, but the connection, the idea of direct speech with verse 8 and verse 9, the direct
Mm-hmm.
speech coming right after the verse 8,
Mm-hmm.
I think these direct speeches are important
Mm-hmm.
because they reference the person that was mentioned before. That's, I don't know if the argument stands enough, but that's how I see it. There are 4 speech bubbles. There are 4 direct speeches in the book of Exodus. And I think we should consider the fact that they are direct speech and they're not indirect speech as the rest of the chapter.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So maybe we can move on to that then. So hypothetically speaking, so obviously the big issue with this view of, going back and forth, besides that I haven't seen necessarily any textual evidence, maybe there is, I just haven't heard it. It seems weird, like it would just be switching back and forth. Like it'd be much more simple to say that, it's referring to 1 or 2 or 3 pharaohs here. So, and as you said with the quotes, it seems like the quotes are referring to that 1 verse 8. So say just hypothetically, like I or Horemheb. So the reason why Falk takes this view that we have I and Horemheb as the ones that are like being mean to the Israelites is because apparently we have texts of them being jerks, and not only that, but we also have texts where the was like King Tut, he dies or whatever, his wife trying to look for a husband. I and Horemheb were the choices. She didn't want either of those, so she goes and tries to find a Hittite king. They go and kill the Hittite king. Is in control after the Hittite king is dead, but they're still worried about the Hittites. So that's why Falk says, okay, it's the Israelites they're worried that the Israelites are going to join with the Hittites. So it's like I get it, like that makes sense with I and Horemheb, that maybe that's what that's referring to. It's a little circumstantial, but it would make sense. So hypothetically speaking, say verse 8, I certainly as a new king after King Tut, or especially in comparison to the whole Joseph's time period, new kings, he certainly doesn't know about Joseph. So he comes to power. He notices that the Israelites are big. He's worried that they're going to join the Hittites. So I or Horemheb, they go and say, hey, we have to oppress the Israelites.
Yeah.
That seems to be a lot more simple than saying that Agmosa and the switching and all that. What do you think about that?
Well, I haven't heard the argument that way made by them. So the idea is, Horemheb is presented as this savage pharaoh because both of them were generals. They were in the army. You can argue about, let's say, half of the 18th or 19th dynasty pharaohs that they were savage.
Right.
Thutmose III pours boiled oil on the head of some of his enemies. Amenhotep II, he just grabs a lot of people and just kills them with his own sword. And you have all kinds of details like this by many pharaohs. So the idea that Horemheb would be savage and he would do this doesn't stand just with him. Right. You can say this about many of them because they had to show, or these strong kings, people have to fear us. Right. And so many of them did these things on purpose, and then they were put on the Steelies and so on the Steely and so on, because they wanted to show how strong and savage and mean they can be to their enemies. So it's circumstantial with Horemheb. It can also be perceived as circumstantial with Amenhotep. Ahmose the First. But this is the consensus at this point, that that new king is Ahmose the First. Carmen Joy mentions this, although she's not an Egyptian. James Hoffmeyer and many others. So unless the consensus changes, you can push the arguments, you can write about it, you can write articles trying to say, okay, we can stop this jump and just go straight forward to that. But I think the argument, the consensus at this point, makes sense that it was Ahmose the First.
Okay, interesting. So, specifically with the Pithom and Ramses part, so the way that I'm reading it is, so it says, so they put 4 men over the Israelites to oppress them with hard labor. This is kind of a translation thing. It basically says, and they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. One issue with this whole view here is that, you're saying that, okay, it's big time gaps here, assuming that the Akhmos thing isn't a problem. Maybe it is, maybe it's not, whatever. With this whole Ramses II thing, all right, so I'm pretty sure that everyone agrees that they were put into slavery before Ramses was built, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking, I don't see it from a grammatical perspective. I don't see any reason why they, verse 11 wouldn't be implying that, okay, the Israelites were put into slavery, and then the conclusion of all this slavery, the main significance here, is what they're saying, is that Pithom and Ramses was built, and that's extremely important here because that's where all this nonsense is happening of the story. There's a time jump, but Genesis does that all the time in regards to an editorial hand kind of thing. It'll say something like, Abraham did this, and now this city is called this. Not like it's an update is what I'm saying. Is what I'm saying is that it's like narrative, inclusions, almost like it's in parentheses. I don't see any reason from the text why that couldn't possibly be. Maybe it's ad hoc. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I think it reflects the original text. I don't think it's a redaction either in a parenthesis or the name was changed from Avaris to Ramses from the original text in the form that we have Exodus right now. So I don't know if that's the direction you wanted to go.
Yeah, so just so I'm on the same page with you. So do you think that at verse 11 it says they put 4 men over the Israelites to impress them with hard labor, and are you thinking immediately they started building Pithom and Ramses?
Looking at the archaeological evidence, I think would be helpful, right?
Right, sure.
We would have information about that. So I took a few parts of my article. I'm working on my new theory for the dating of the Exodus. And there are basically both of these cities are known. Some might object to Pithom, the location of Pithom, but others accept that its location is at Tel Rotaba. That's mostly the consensus, at least of the maximalists like James Hoffmeyer, David Falk, if we keep mentioning him, and others, that Tel Rotaba is Pithom. Now, when we look at the archaeological evidence, we see that after Ahmose I conquered the northern kingdom, we see that immediately after, in the early 18th dynasty, we have 12 silos built over 3 phases. The archaeological work there is done by a Polish-Slovak team that excavates Tela Rotaba. And at the same time, domestic and industrial structures were dated by the pottery to the early 18th dynasty. And it's interesting that you have 12 silos built over 3 phases. They go from about 1520 to 1450-ish. I don't remember exactly when these silos were built. So it's interesting that right after Ahmose conquers the northern kingdom, you have evidence like this. The place was lived by other people. They worked there. You have all kinds of evidence that there were people that were doing crafts and working at Pithom, accepting that Pithom is Tela Retaba. So this is the kind of evidence you were asking about soon after?
Oh
Because
yeah, that's very interesting.
that's
Yes.
right after Ahmose the First. So we're just talking within 1-2 decades when we start seeing this evidence, even soon right after.
That's for Pithom, but Ramses though, right? Is
Okay, we're
later.
gonna go to Ramses as well.
Sure.
We could say a lot of things about Pithom, and the research in Tel Rotaba is taking
Okay.
place as we speak. So
Okay.
that's exciting. It's 2 Eastern European countries that have been doing all this work in Rotaba, while at Avaris, the work has been much longer, since the 1960s, and it has been led by Manfred Bitok from the Austrian universities, and he's just done an amazing job. So, looking at this point, it wasn't called Ramses. It was called Avaris. Soon after Ahmose the First conquered Peru Nefer, as was the Egyptian name. Bitak affirms about the remaining Asiatics that they were distributed all over the country as slaves and soldiers during the reign of Ahmose the First. And in the early phase of the 18th dynasty, Avaris was mainly a storage city built to facilitate the existence of a military camp. We need to understand that Avaris was a major hub, economical hub, because it was up the Nile stream, and at the same time, it was a good place to launch military campaigns into the Levant. He goes on and says the excavations never provided an indication of a large-scale destruction of the town after the conquest of the city by Ahmose, while, and this is interesting, the unchanging pottery production into the early 18th dynasty show a certain continuity on the site. So what he's saying is, we looked at the pottery, and the Hyksos pottery and what comes after Ahmose conquers, there are similarities between the style of the pottery. You would expect the local slaves to produce these potteries, and not necessarily the Egyptians, especially if you had them enslaved. And I think this fits well with the biblical statement that the Pharaoh who didn't know Joseph used the Semitic population as free workforce to build the storage cities of Pithom and Ramses.
Okay, so that obviously assumes that Ramses of Avaris.
Well, it doesn't necessarily need to mean that, but
Okay.
it implies that. I think the discussion is much more complicated because it moves from the archaeology to the source criticism, redaction criticism, and all that. And if you take the view if it's a retrojection or if it's a redaction, as the early daters take, and the discussion is pretty difficult here. Now, in his video on Pithom, Dr. Falk says at one point that the Semites at Pithom have left the city on or prior to the reign of Amenhotep I. And he's aiming here at Kennedy. I quote him: essentially, the abandonment Titus Kennedy is talking about occurred 150 to 200 years prior to the early Exodus date and would not be repopulated with Semites until the beginning of Dynasty 19. But we know that the city Pithom was populated until about 14ish hundred, and then there's a period of 100 years when there's a gap, and then again it's repopulated in the 19th dynasty. I agree with that. It doesn't mean that the Exodus took place right about that time. What I wanted to say is Dr. Falk is very certain to say the Semitics left on or prior to the reign of Amenhotep I. So I went and I looked at the research done by the archaeologists at Tel Rotaba, and they aren't as certain as he is. They're saying the following thing: the very beginning of the New Kingdom is now represented in the corpus of ceramics. One could speculate that there was a Hyksos population on the site through the times of Hatshepsut Tutmosis III, but the evidence for the hypothesis is still forthcoming. So it's not certain at this point, as the archaeological work is still taking place. He could be right, he could be wrong, but usually you don't make strong statements when you don't have evidence. You just need for the evidence to come out. Saying a definite no might end up with being a yes, and then you have to change your statement on that. At least that's where the archaeological data is pointing at this time. It's maybe yes, maybe no. We don't know yet.
So what you're saying, basically saying, is that Falk was saying like your theory with this time period of Pithom doesn't work, but the archaeological evidence doesn't necessarily say that.
There might have been Semitics that have continued to live there from among the Hyksos, or there might have not. We just don't know at this point. And like I said, the research is still taking place. The pandemic affected the research by a few years. So hopefully some research that was done in the past years will get published more, and they've started to publish more since about 2022.
Gotcha. Yeah. So my understanding, and I haven't looked at the evidence for it, is my understanding is that Egypt, like specifically Ahmose the First, completely destroyed like the Hyksos, just like obliterated them so that they don't exist at all after this time period. I would assume that you disagree with that. Do you know what the evidence is for that this supposedly destroyed her?
Well, he did have just some, we could consider them minor campaigns within Canaan, and he just fought against specific cities there. It's just a couple of them, a few of them. I don't remember the exact number, but it's not a lot. The big campaigner that went all the way to the Euphrates was Tutmos I. He was Hatshepsut's father. So he was the big campaigner that went into Canaan. He went all the way into Syria and then all the way into Mitanni land. But when it comes to Ahmose I, what he did was mostly in the country. Now, I don't have any evidence, or at least I don't know it. I might be wrong. I haven't read everything that is out there that he would have killed the Hyksos within the country, completely obliterated them. I'm sure he killed a lot, and we know that he killed a lot of the enemies, but it doesn't mean he killed them all. They rarely did this to just kill all the enemies. Many times they took slaves and they brought them into the country. So if you have a large population that is already there in the country, and you could turn them into slave, into workforce, why not take advantage of that? Because imagine they had situations where they brought tens of thousands of slaves for days and days, and that's not easy work. When you have it there in the country, I think that's an advantage.
Yeah. So your theory is that the Hyksos and they were afraid that they were going to join the Hyksos, so they
I
put
didn't
the
say
Israelites as
necessarily
slaves,
the
right?
Hyksos. I said that the Hyksos
Okay.
would make them think twice about any possible enemy that could
Okay.
come
Right.
from
Right.
within. So I'm not saying the Hyksos were the threat that they were looking at, But the
Mm.
history taught them
Oh, okay.
that you can never underestimate an ethnic group that remains united, and you just let
Mm.
them do whatever they want in your country, because you never know what's
Mm.
going to happen in the future.
Okay. So if you don't necessarily say that, I mean, isn't it verse 10 says if a war breaks out, they will ally themselves with our enemies and fight against us to leave the country. So Falk's view is that the only enemies we really ever see is the Hittites. So why would we think that there would be anybody else if the Hyksos are already destroyed? So under your view, wouldn't you have to say that they would be where they're going to join the Hyksos?
It doesn't say which enemies here.
Right.
And the other thing is, look at what the last part of verse 10 says. They'll fight against us and leave the country. That's an interesting aspect I only observed recently. It doesn't
Okay.
mean they're afraid they're going to take over the country, but they're going to cause great damage in their desire to leave the country.
Hmm.
Because when you had wars, the military left the country, and
Hmm.
that made the country to be able to be attacked. Because when you have your military going to Canaan or going to Syria, in that situation, if you have a free population that would want to leave but they can't, um, they're gonna do whatever they can in order to leave the country. And another aspect is, we know that the Israelites wanted to go to Canaan. We know their stories. We know their history from Genesis. But
Hmm.
don't you think that the Pharaoh or the pharaohs already knew where they wanted to go? Because that's another reason for which the Pharaoh of the Exodus didn't want to let them leave. Because he knew, if I'm not going to fight them here now and their God, I'm going to have to fight them in Canaan anyway, because that was controlled by them as well. So I think that's
Hmm.
another reason they didn't want to let them leave the country, because they knew where they wanted to go. And what
Hmm.
the pharaohs of the early 18th dynasty wanted to do was to control all the land up to the Euphrates. That was their goal. It wasn't the same control as in Egypt proper, but these were vassal states which paid tribute, which paid with slaves, which paid with a lot of other things. So they wanted this control because it brought a lot of money into their country and it helped their economy.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk about specifically like how long they were in Egypt. So you have the 430 number, you have like 400 given by Abraham, you have um or is it 430? I don't actually have the text in front of me.
Genesis 15 is 400.
400, okay. And then, some argue that it's referring to the time in Canaan, but also Egypt, like a combination of the two. Do you have a specific reason why you don't think that's right?
Um, so Apostle Paul sides with the Septuagint in Galatians chapter 3, where he
Mm-hmm.
says that the time from the giving of the promise, meaning the calling of Abraham, to the
Mm-hmm.
time of the giving of the law at Mount Sinai was 430 years, which happened in the first year of the Exodus.
Mm-hmm.
And so he puts together, according to Exodus 12:40, he puts together the time spent in Canaan and in Egypt. Also, the Samaritan Pentateuch sides with the Septuagint here too.
Mm.
And
So,
go ahead.
so it is Egypt and Canaan then, is
It
what you're
is
saying.
Egypt and Canaan. I think in the Samaritan Pentateuch is Canaan and Egypt. It just flips it, but the argument remains.
Okay. So you don't necessarily have a issue with that. Um, so you agree with Falk in that case then?
Uh, I don't even know where he stands on this. If he stands with the
Okay.
Septuagint or the Masoretic.
Well, not necessarily that, but the how long they were. Well, not necessarily how long they were in Egypt, but whether that 430 number refers to all of Egypt or Egypt and Canaan.
Yeah, I don't think he takes a literal view of these numbers here, but I think he sides as a variant with the Septuagint. Yes, for years I've been seeing things the same way. A lot of people go with verse 13 in Genesis 15. You referenced it. It says, "Then the Lord said to Abraham, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years." Now, I've read this verse the same way many times, referencing the idea that there will be 400 years in Egypt.
Okay.
But his offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, can just as well reference to Canaan, because at that point Canaan wasn't theirs. And will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. There are just three sequences: sojourners, servants, and afflicted.
Mm.
And when you look into the Hebrew text, it can be clear that it can reference to these things taken together, Canaan and Egypt, because they were sojourners in Canaan.
Mm.
It wasn't their land. So that's how I understand this verse, and I don't
Mm.
think it contradicts the idea of 430 being the total.
Mm. So you said late daters place Joseph under the Hyksos, but reject the numbers of both 1 Kings 6:1 and Exodus 12:40.
As a
So,
general rule, yeah, they wouldn't
yeah.
necessarily take these, although it kind of fits. I don't know for certain about Jace Meyer, but he kind of places it right about 1690, 1700, so 1260 plus. Well, in this case, he would go with the Masoretic. No, they would go with the Masoretic text.
Hmm. Okay.
430.
So, I mean, if anyone wants to listen to why, scholars don't take 1 Kings 6:1 literally, go check the Falk and Titus Kennedy debate on it. Exodus 12:40 though, what reason do you think that we should take this as, completely literally?
I don't think there is any powerful argument. Um, I think it should be worked with, depending on the period you start from. Like I said, it could be 430, it could be 215 in Egypt. And what people usually do is they take one of the two if it favors their position. That's what
Mm.
most do. Also, with the early daters, they almost always favor the Masoretic text, and they leave aside the Septuagint. Rarely have I seen early daters using the variants from the Septuagint, although there are
Mm.
quite a few. Um, Maybe I'm exaggerating. It is not necessarily a general rule, but specifically in Exodus 12:40, almost all the ones that I've read go with
Mm.
430 years in Egypt.
Hmm. So, do you know the views of Falk and all that about why they don't take Exodus 12:40 literally?
I haven't heard him talk on this or write on this, but with late daters, there
There
is,
is.
as a general rule, a reluctance to take such big numbers as literal.
Okay, so one of the scholars I recently talked to argued that uh, this 430 number is arguing that, or not arguing, but they have the generations, the number 40. Um, oftentimes, especially with First King 6:1, there's good reason to think that it's taking 40 times, what is it, 12? Uh,
That would be 480. That's a different number in
what is
First
what
Kings
is First
6.
King 6:1?
It's 480 in the Masoretic.
And the Masoretic. Okay, so
Mhm.
first 488. Okay, yep. So 40 times 12. Yep,
12,
that's yeah, right.
480.
Yeah. Okay, just making sure. So, okay, so I understand what you're saying now. Okay. Right. So 480. Obviously, that there's good reason to think, in my opinion at least, that it's they're doing something with the number 40 there. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so I've also heard that for Exodus 12:40, 430 years could be referring to, all right, say a generation is 40 years or 40 time, or, what is 400 divided by 40? That's 10. So maybe it's like 10 generations ish. And then the 30 refers to like the end, but it's not finished period. So like, I don't know, like the almost done with that 11th generation, but not completely done with it yet. And I mean, maybe that seems like a weird view to take. I don't necessarily, considering what we know about the number 40, I don't see a big reason to think that it's not possible. Although I think there's a ton of evidence to think that the four generations that are referred to in Exodus 6 aren't supposed to be like that there were only four generations. I think there's a ton of evidence for that. Do you have an opinion on it? Do you think there was actually only four generations, and that each generation of Exodus 6 lived, 100 plus years?
Well, obviously, if you go with the 430 years, you can't make them. They'd have babies when they're over 100 years. But 215 years could be closer to reality, because when you actually look into the genealogies that you have in the Torah after they leave Egypt, it's not actually four generations. It's a little bit more than that. Now, there are four generations that lived in Egypt, and basically some of them died in Egypt on the fourth generation, but you also have some on the fourth generation still being alive and living, probably the older people. Yet when you look, you can see also a fifth, a sixth, and sometimes even a seventh generation. So it depends. You would have them having babies. So if you go with 6 generations, 6 times 40 is 240. So they'd have babies in a median way in their 30s, which is plausible.
So what you're saying is that you should take that 430 number and cut it in half?
Because 215 is spent in Canaan and 215 is spent in Egypt. That's the Septuagint view.
Of Exodus 12:40.
Exactly.
Interesting. Okay. All right. Interesting. Interesting. Okay. So Falk's view for Exodus 6 is that, these are clans, which, I mean, it seems pretty obvious that they are clans. The question is, whether, it's describing one person that lived a certain amount of time period, whether it's symbolic, or whether that is the length of the clan.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting topic, would take a lot of time to get into. But I think that there's pretty good evidence to say that, it wasn't just four generations there. First Chronicles 6 maybe, or First Chronicles 7, that it describes like, I mean, there's a little debate about it, but and the tribe of Ephraim, which Ephraim comes into Egypt with Jacob and Joseph and all of them, and then he dies in Egypt, and then there's another mention of Ephraim in that passage, and it is specifically says that he's in Canaan. So unless if there's some like ridiculous,
you're talking about his descendants?
Yeah, right. His descendants.
First Chronicles 7, I think it is, or 6.
Right. Yeah, it's 7. That makes sense. But there's like, 10 or whatever, 12, maybe 11 generations from Joseph to Joshua.
Mm-hmm.
But then the Exodus 6 genealogy only mentions Levi, Kohath, Amram, and then Moses. So there's only 4. But of course, some were already even alive when they go into Exodus.
In addition,
okay, here, Jochebed Amram's wife is referred to as the daughter of Levi in Numbers 26:59, and Amram's father, which is supposedly Kohath's sister, is in Exodus 6:20, which would place Jochebed with her brother Kohath at the entrance of the Israelites into Egypt. Thus, she would have to be at least 350 years old when she gave birth to Moses if there were no gaps in the Mosaic genealogies. So like weird things like that, and there's others that we could talk about maybe later. But so how does so you think that it's 215? I mean, are you like do you think that's exact, or do you think that is like there's wiggle room there?
Well, that's what we have, and I'm just gonna go whatever, if there is or not a wiggle room. I don't have anything else to go with.
Well, I
So
mean specifically like, maybe not instead of 215, it's 200 and then 230. You know.
there are variants even in the Septuagint, 5 years plus minus.
Oh.
So yeah, you have some manuscripts with 435 in Exodus 1240, but they're not considered reliable. I don't exactly know the discussion around this, but I know there is this variant.
I think that's all I wanted to talk about. Yeah. So, any last thoughts?
Yeah, the Exodus is a very interesting topic. I have been trying to work on a new theory, and I hope to have it in about 2 years and write a peer-reviewed article. I don't want to give too much info until it's peer reviewed, but you might find tidbits here and there where I lean, and certain things that I take from the late view, certain things I take from the early view.
Yeah.
It's a mix, but I'm with neither of them.
Gotcha. Yeah. So no, it's really interesting. I I think this is a great opportunity, this discussion, not specifically like, to say like, okay, I'm right or you're right. Obviously, I'm not an expert on this topic anyway, so nobody's going to think that for me. But specifically, what I would like to see is some of these arguments addressed, maybe comments on if they have an issue with like your arguments, like, let's see some discussion about it.
Sure.
And then, maybe we can get some pushback on, other things that I've said, or maybe some clarity. But obviously, I think this is a good opportunity just to understand the text more and learn more about history. So this has been great.
Yeah.
Really appreciate it. Everyone go out, check out Benny's channel. Really good stuff there. And he's going to be talking more about the Exodus. So that'll be fun. And it'd be great to hear about your peer review article whenever it comes out.
Hopefully it'll be out, and I'm looking for a PhD program to start, and my PhD thesis will be on this topic.
Oh, sick. Awesome. Sweet. All right. Well, it's been fun, Benny. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.
Awesome. Yes, sir.